Pesach. But can this have one per person?
One per person?
Okay, good evening. Thank you again for sponsoring. Thank you. Indeed. Thank you. Let me ask you, when you all grew up, did you have illustrated Haggadahs?
Oh, yes.
You did?
Yeah, we got them from Israel.
From Maxwell, from Israel?
No, from Israel. We never got printing had been invented. We had the Sheikh Haggadah.
Sheikh Haggadah.
Yeah.
The illustrated Haggadah has an impact on children, on readers. They develop an image of Egypt based on what they see. That's how we work. So many of us believe that our ancestors, as they walked out of Mitzrayim, they were carrying their Matzah and they were drinking Maxwell coffee, right? Because there was a Maxwell Haggadah, there's no question about that. The impact of the moving picture has had a significant effect as well on the vision, the way we imagine the past. So many people have an image of Moshe Rabbeinu standing on a rock because Charleston Heston, right, was standing there when he brought down the Torah, right, holding a rifle. He's a member of the National Rifle Association in the United States, so that's the link there. Children of this generation have an image of Moshe, and dealing with kids, you hear them mentioning the fact that Moshe killed an Egyptian by pushing him off some elevated construction structure. Why do they have a specific image of that? Well, due to the fact that Disney, when they created the latest movie of the Prince of Egypt, that's how Moshe kills the Egyptian. In other words, everything is affected by the image we have from the illustrated Haggadah, movies we watch. And I myself, growing up, I was always fascinated by these Haggadahs, the images. They date back to the 16th century, by the way. There are illustrated Haggadahs from the early 16th century. So it's so much part of our tradition. The Haggadahs are the books that have been reprinted and published in more editions than any other Jewish text, meaning there are the variations. There are thousands of Haggadahs that have been put out throughout the centuries. Now, specifically, what I'm going to focus on is the image that I have, and the correct image that I have of the matzah that our ancestors carried as they walked out, or the matzahs that were made with the dough that they carried out of Egypt. How did they look? How did the matzah look? So, if a lafa, pita, somewhere in between the two, perhaps thicker than the average pita and the average lafa, but that's the matzah that they ate. And the Talmud has discussions of a situation that you find during Pesach, a piece of bread, and you're not sure if it's a matzah or if it's chametz. Now, nowadays, if I find in my house a bagel, I know it's chametz, and if I find a matzah, I know it most probably Pesach. So obviously, and there are dozens of indications that the matzah of the past was thick. And as I sit down for the Seder night and want to educate my children about a tradition, the fact that we are linked to the past, and when I point at that matzah, and I say, Matzah zu shanu ochlu mal shuma, why are we eating the matzah? And I tell my children that you should know that it's the matzah that we eat because our ancestor ate the exact same matzah when they left Egypt. And if my child is a little bit educated, the child's going to ask, wait a second, really, is that so? Was it exactly the same? Wasn't the matzah of the past thick? And I'll say, yeah. Wasn't the matzah of the past round? And I'm going to have to go ahead and admit, yes, that we squared it at some point. And my child's going to ask, why? Why those changes? Or when did they happen? And I'm going to have to give them a long answer of when did it deflate? When did it become square? These are things that are significant, but they fascinate me. because we are so much into tradition and so much into linking ourselves to the past, but yet adjustment and changes do occur, and I love studying those changes. When, how, why, who was behind it, what era. And you look for evidence. As you study halachic literature, you look for evidence to try to find that period. When did it change? So we're going to go ahead and break down our class into two sections. Section number one is going to deal with the deflated matzah. In other words, when did the shift occur from a thicker matzah to the thin one we are familiar with? And number two, we're going to go ahead and revisit from round to square, because we discussed last year the great controversy in the late 1850s in Lemberg between great rabbinic authorities regarding the machine matzah. And this year we're going to go ahead and revisit the topic, because I think it had an impact on the way at least I practice my Seder night with machine shmura. Let me make it clear, machine shmura matzah that is square. So we're going to go ahead and deal with the deflated matzah. Now, just for the record, thick, it used to be thick, right? Like the Yemenites and the Sephardim have it, and we have it like a cracker. The Mogen Avraham, a great rabbinic authority of the 17th century, talks about a situation where they have in an oven a matzah that folded over, and a folded over matzah becomes, we consider it like chametz. So the folded over matzah was taken out with some utensil, and then the utensil touches another matzah. So there's a question, what do you do with the second matzah that was touched by a utensil that touched the first matzah that we consider problematic? So after a brief discussion, he notes the right thing to do is to peel a section of the matzah off, and the rest of it is good. You peel. Now, I give homework to everyone here on Seder night. If you're a little bit bored during that, gotta try to peel your matzah. Right? How far are you going to go with it? Obviously, if it was like a pita or a thick pita, you could peel a section off. You're not going to go ahead and peel your matzah in this day and age. When did that happen? When did the shift occur among Ashkenazi Jewry? There are many, many different theories as to why is it that in the Talmud we are warned, and this is something I'm very strict, by the way, with, that your matzah should not be more than a tefach. A tefach is about 3 inches. So I should not catch anyone here with a matzah, not a matzah box. A matzah that is thicker than 3 inches. Okay, that's what the Talmud states. So there was an awareness. And nowadays, we obviously have these thin crackers. When did it occur? There are different theories. I'm going to share with you something that I feel had an impact on the development of the deflating matzah into cracker. Now, Jews, believe it or not, have been artistic for many, many centuries. The concept of the Jew as an artist is not new. In the wilderness, there was a fellow by the name of Bezalel. So we like using art to enhance our Judaism. Nothing new about that. In the days of the Gemara, there were those that had a desire to enhance the matzah as well, the matzah of the Talmud. So the Talmud has a discussion about srikin hametsuyarim, about these combs that were used to make designs on matzahs, designs of fish, of birds, maybe the 10 plagues, I don't know, but they made designs on matzahs. And the Talmud knows that there could be a problem with it, because the artist wants his product, wants his piece of art to be perfect. And if he's going to stand there, or she's going to stand there, trying to make the perfect bird, and after 17 and a half minutes, she realizes that it's not perfect yet, and she asks for 2 more minutes, as the dough is sitting there before it is baked, we have a very serious issue, because your matzah becomes chametz. So therefore the rabbis say, Ein osin srikin hamitzuyarin, that for Pesach, even if you are able to go ahead and make that design with ease, and you are very fast in what you could achieve, nevertheless avoid it. Do not do it. Now, The Talmud talks about a person who had some kind of tfus, like a press. So in other words, there was no need to stand there with it and make a design with some perforator, but rather they were able to just push it into the dough, make the shape, and bake it. Nevertheless, the rabbis say, even if you have such a device, no designs on your matzah. That's what the rabbis say. One rabbinic authority gives allowance. He says, you know what, says Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says, I tell you that in some circumstances I do allow it. Of course, they have to bake it as soon as possible, but nevertheless, if you go ahead and make them like rekikin, if you make your matzah like rekikin, in such a case, I do allow you to make a design. That's what Rabbi Yossi tells us. What are rekikin? So the commentators explain. If it is dak, if it is thin, I allow you, says Rabbi Yossi, to go ahead and make a design because it doesn't become chametz as fast. When it's thick, it could develop into chametz perhaps even sooner than 18 minutes, who knows, but it is thin, and artists usually don't take so long to make their design. Rabbi Yossi gives his allowance for rekikin. Rabbi Yossi is a minority opinion, meaning most rabbinic authorities do not allow srikin hamitsuyarin, designs on your matzah. Rabbi Yossi, the minority, allows it. That's the Talmud. Okay, so we just visited the 3rd century. 2nd century, we can move forward now to the 11th century in Germany, in the city of Speyer. In the city of Speyer, there were great rabbinic authorities there. Among them, there was a Rabbi Yitzchak ben Asher. And Rabbi Yitzchak ben Asher was visiting a bakery, Erev Pesach, visiting a bakery, and he realized that the matzahs coming out were very good matzahs, hand matzahs, nice matzahs. However, they had designs on them. They had designs, right? Not just, an S for stripes, but rather there was an actual design on them. So he tried to find within traditional sources a way of defending the practice. And he notes, you know what, it is very possible that the people in this community who must have a tradition that it is okay, it dates back to the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. And since they who make the designs make their matzahs rekikin, they make their matzahs thin, so therefore they do have the legal and halachic right to make designs. That's what Rabbi Yitzchak ben Asher said in the 11th century. You want to know why it is okay to make the designs? Because they are thin. Now, if you look at authorities a little bit later, meaning in the 14th and 15th century, they say the following. They say, listen, yes, there was perhaps a tradition, but it's not ideal. And for example, one of the great rabbinic authorities had an impact on minhag was a Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Tirno. Okay, they say that he's one of the, if not the first Hungarian authority. In other words, Jews did not live in Hungary in the 14th century. In the beginning of the 15th century, there are communities developing there. So this Isaac Tirna is an Hungarian who wrote a book of minhagim, who is describing the customs that existed in that period. And he notes that lechatchila, ideally, it is not appropriate to make designs. Like, please avoid it. He's turning to the communities. And he's saying, you know what, you want to enhance your seder, you want to beautify the matzah for the mitzvah, fine, but it's not ideal. Even if you go ahead, and even if you follow the practice of making them thin, nevertheless, I recommend not to. Okay? Even if you make them thin, which according to Rabbi Yossi would avoid the problem, I recommend not to. And then I move forward to the 17th century, to Rabbi Yoel Sirkis, who passed away in 1640. And he wrote that you should know, Achshav Nahagule Isur, nowadays, by the 17th century, it's not just a recommendation, meaning in the 12th century, 11th, 12th century, it was done. In the 15th century, the rabbis were saying, better not do it. By the 17th century, the rabbis say, nowadays, nahagu le'isur, it is something that it is avoided, period. So you will no longer find designs, okay? But nevertheless, there was a time that they allowed designs because they were thin. And if you look at the structure of Shulchan Aruch, how does the Shulchan Aruch work? Rav Yosef Karo makes a statement. Rav Moshe Isserles, the Ashkenazi authority of Poland from the 16th century, makes a comment where the Shulchan Aruch says you should know that you do not make designs. However, the perforator that is used to make holes, that it should not create bubbles, that can be done even if a design develops. Comes the Ramah and he tells us that you should know another way of avoiding the issue of any designs, meaning one would concern himself that perhaps the perforator will create some kind of image. And the rabbis told us to avoid all images. So therefore he notes, but worry not, because making them thin avoids that problem. So what it seems to be, and what I'm presenting to you now, is the following. It is very possible that the shrinkage, that the deflation, that's a good word, of our matzah was recommended due to the fact that designs were made. Designs are no longer made, but nevertheless the practice of making them thin remains. So that is a little piece in this mystery. Why did they become thin? Some say, well, they started baking them before Pesach, and since they started baking them before Pesach, so therefore if they would make them thick, they would become moldy, so therefore they made them like crackers. That's one theory. My explanation is a little bit different. It relates to the idea that, yes, there was a period that they made designs. When you make designs, you rely on Rabbi Yossi, who allows it when it is thin, so therefore they made it thin. So at least I have a little bit the way of defending to my children the difference between the picture that they have in their Haggadah of Moshe's matzah to my matzah. But now it's time to work on a more critical issue, shapes. Children learn shapes before anything else, right? And they had these Fisher-Price cylinder, which was yellow. It had 3 holes on top, right? The square, the triangle, and the circle. And you learn that a child's developing when they learn how to start placing the right shape into the right hole. That's the first toy that actually requires shapes they know. And therefore, at a very young age, a child that never has to grow up in my home and see the square matzahs, even for the Seder night, must be explained, right? And it's very, very tough, especially in a society where my children are embarrassed by the fact that their friends are also holy and they use the round hand, and they never have to accept my minhag of square. So I want to analyze, where did my minhag come from? Right? Who in my family, or why did they adapt it? So the truth is, several of the minhagim that we have in our family originate in the land of Israel. They originate in the land of Israel. And you'll say, where do I come from the land that my grandfather was in Lithuania, right? Uruguay, it's not a Uruguayan minhag from the days of Moshe Rabbeinu. Where exactly does it come from? Well, perhaps my grandfather spent 5 years from 1924 to 1929 in the city of Hebron. He was sent with 6 other boys from a suburb of Kovna by the name of Slobodka to Hebron, and they opened the yeshiva there in the city of Hebron. And he was there until July, from 1924, Pesach time, until July of 1929. Luckily, he got out about a month before the August massacre. He got out. So there are minhagim, I do know, I found, I have in my office copies of his smichas he got from the great rabbis there. He interacted with the rabbis of Jerusalem. Some of the rabbis of the old yeshuv almost fainted when they met them for the first time, because the Slobodka philosophy was that you have to dress like a modern person, right? You have to interact with the world. It was a Musar yeshiva, which at that time Musar still meant that you act like a normal human being. So they dressed with modern white suits and white hats, and when they came to the old yeshuv to Jerusalem and they were waiting to meet the great scholars who came from Lithuania, they see these maskilim, they see this group of, it was a very difficult experience for the rabbis of Jerusalem until, they started discussing what really binds us, our Torah. Then they realized that, they're actually great young men. And it was a very special experience for the people who studied there. Israel, it starts in Israel, and that's what we're going to go ahead and do. We're going to do some homework now, but first we have to learn names. Last year we taught names, but now we really have to focus on names, and I was kind enough to print out, right, a handout. You got the handout? And you have to know the names. And once you know the names, you could deal with my journey, and it will be called the 1908 Controversy of Jerusalem. Are you ready? Let's go with the names. Now, first of all, in our tradition, the way you know if somebody is a somebody is if he is linked to somebody. In other words, in some societies, you determine if a guy is a professional or well-respected by the amount of stripes on his sleeve or on his shoulder, or the diplomas on his wall, or the type of garb he'll wear when he's walking down a procession, honoring someone to give him an honorable doctorate, whatever it is. In the Torah world, it is often who he is linked to. In other words, he is a Talmud of Moshe Feinstein. He must be someone we should respect. Correct? In the first decades of the 20th century, if you were a Talmud, a disciple of the great Rabbi Yisrael from Salant, you're a somebody. Now, there were many somebodies. We're going to focus on a few, just to give you a little bit of a feeling. One of them, a name you should remember, because he made his way to the land of Israel, and he had an impact. He brought Musar teachings to the land of Israel. His name was Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam. That was his name. The family originated in Amsterdam decades or centuries earlier. One is Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam. Another person who was impacted by Rabbi Yisrael Salant in the middle of the 19th century. Rabbi Yisrael Salant, of course, is the father of the Musar movement, a person who we've studied. We're going to analyze him again in the near future, hopefully. But disciple number 2 that I threw in, we're not going to be discussing him, but it's a name you're familiar with, was Rabbi Kalonimus Wysotsky. Wysotsky T, established, I think, around 1849. Look at your box when you get home. He was a disciple of Rabbi Yisrael Salant and a supporter. Okay? The third one we're going to discuss, left Europe at some point, we're going to discuss him a bit later, was Rav Dov Ber. Rav Dov Ber, at least his family claims, was the favorite Talmud of Rabbi Yisrael Salant. Okay, they wrote it in the books that describe his life. But we do know that he was Rav Dov Ber was the personal shochet for Rabbi Yisrael at some point when Rabbi Yisrael lived in the city of Memel. Memel was a city, a town that was not extremely observant at the time in the middle of the 19th century. Rabbi Yisrael landed up there. Rav Dov Ber was his shochet. Remind me, we'll get back to Rav Dov Ber. He had an impact on our discussion. So we talked a little bit about the Musar school. Now, so far so good, the 3 names will be remembered. Thank you. Now, round 2, we have to talk about a few great Hasidic poskim. Now, there's something unique there. Among the Hasidim, their greatness is not often due to the fact that they are extremely knowledgeable in tradition and text and halacha. Some of them are not, right? But among the Hasidim, there were 3 that were considered great poskim that even the non-Hasidic world, quotes, studies, analyzes, discusses their teachings and their halacha. Great rabbinic authorities. And as you can imagine, Hasidim too have the structure, a looser structure, but they nevertheless have the halachic structure. So to them, if you quote a statement by the great Divrei Chaim, Reb Chaim Halberstam, or if you are a descendant, like the Twerskis are descendants of the Divrei Chaim with great pride. Many of them even etch it onto their tombstones with great pride, a descendant of the Divrei Chaim, a great rabbinic authority, Hasidic. So there's going to be an impact in halacha as well, as you can imagine, far more traditional. If it was done in the Alta Haim, it must be from Sinai, right? If the garb was if we wear our socks over our pants, that's because Moshe Rabbeinu did it, a very much an attachment and reverence to the past. So posik number one, which you must remember to pass the course, is Rabbi Chaim Halberstam of Sanz, the Divrei Chaim. So we're going to be calling him the Divrei Chaim. Authority number two that you must remember is the Maharsham. Now the Maharsham, Rabbi Shalom Mordechai Shwadron, his grandson became well known as the Maggid of Yerushalayim. The Maharsham is well respected due to the fact that he had the ability of coming up with a leniency when needed. Okay? He gets the title of Koach Dehetera Adif. In other words, the person who can only come up with a chumrah. You don't have to be a great scholar. Right? It's very easy to say Osir, Osir, a 4-year-old. You go ahead and paskin on everything and say Osir. To go ahead and say that something is permissible, a lot is demanded there. And that was the Maharsham. And other rabbis, when they would quote the Maharsham, they would have to explain themselves why they're quoting him. Right? They had to defend themselves that, I know in general we don't just quote Maharsham, but he was extremely well respected in authority among the Hasidim, respected and quoted. The third one is the Avnei Nezer, Rabbi Avram Ronstein from Sachashav. The Sachashav Hasidic dynasty comes from him. Another third great rabbinic authorities. Remember the names? And now it's time to discuss the next controversy. Last year we had an extended talk about the events of 1857 through 1859. It had to do with the machine matzah. The machine, a very primitive and a very a crude machine, was invented in 1838 in France by a fellow by the name of Isaac Singer. Not related to our Isaac Singer, not related to the Singer sewing machine, but nevertheless was invented by a Jew by the name of Isaac Singer. It did not do the complete work and it was not electric, but nevertheless it played a role in producing the dough. And throughout the 1840s and the 1850s, it spreads throughout France, England, and Germany. It reaches, as it is traveling to the east, it reaches Galicia, and there it has to deal with a very traditional community that is afraid of the changes that are coming from the west. If it is from the west, it is treif. So last year we discussed the controversies in Lemberg that brought in the great rabbinic authorities of that era. Among them was the Divrei Chaim. The Divrei Chaim said that machine matzos are chametz, and I can't share with you the reason. Okay, and therefore the debate ended right there, because you can no longer have a discussion with someone says I'm not showing you my cards. That's what happened. And among the Hasidim, the machine matzah was unacceptable, and there are stories of rabbis who, when they would burn their chametz, they would burn machine matzah as well. That which I would eat, they would use for the 10 pieces. I would do the other way around, perhaps, but that's what was done, and that was the era that existed then. Major to do in the Jewish world, there's an aftershock in 1908. What's happening in 1908 is there's a developing yishuv in Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is expanding. They're outside of the old city. Give credit to Montefiore and Judah Turo, right, for funding these expansions. And by 1908, Jerusalem is growing with great difficulty. The Turks are not easy to deal with. To acquire land is quite challenging. 1908, I think, is the year of the young Turks, right, that took over. But nevertheless, the challenges were there. A community is developing there. And matzahs are produced by machine. There is a machine production of shmura matzah, square matzahs in Yerushalayim. One morning, a few weeks before Pesach, walking to shul, you see plastered to the wall a warning. And the warning was that machine matzahs are coming to town after the great rabbinic authorities of Europe prohibited them. And therefore, woe to our community that we have these chametz productions. They're unacceptable. And even the rabbis who would have allowed it in Europe would not allow it in Jerusalem. And in a lengthy discussion on the wall, and that's how news was transmitted at that point. It still exists, by the way, pashkevilin they're called, where someone will print up his information, his view of a situation, plaster it to the wall, everyone else would read, and that's going to be discussed in the shtibel, in the shul, in the mikvah. That's going to be the topic discussed in town. So there was a to-do about the machine matzahs in Yerushalayim. It is unacceptable. The next day there's a pashkavil on top of that one, why it's 100% permissible. And even those who in Europe would say it's problematic would agree that here it is okay because it's a far better piece of equipment. And the next day, those who prohibited would put their statement. And that's how that really, the stones of Jerusalem and Masharim, it is not cement that keeps them together. It is these pashkevilin, right? These plastered announcements that keeps them together. The discussion goes back and forth in a very significant debate. But then suddenly, one of the statements has a very significant impact on the community. Because in one of the statements they say, and this was maybe the sixth one, from those who allow it, that you should know, don't make a big to-do, you Chassidim. It seems to be they were the drive behind the issue, because the Maharsham, Rabbi Shvadron, a Hasidic authority, gave his approval. Okay, a Hasidic authority gave his approval. And that is a big shocker. In other words, among the Hasidim that are extremely traditional, they believed, and the attitude was that there is no one that's going to allow it from our school, and here suddenly they present a Hasidic authority who gives a green light. Now that was already extremely significant. And when the Avnei Nezer of Sachachov, hears that the Maharsham, Rabbi Shvadron, gives a green light, he was fuming, and he called him basically, how is it possible that a fly will compete against the lion? In other words, we have these great authorities in the past who said it is prohibited. What a chutzpah he has, what a chutzpah, because those are people that are far greater than him. It was a big major to do about what the Maharsham initially said. When the Maharsham got wind of the tumult, he claimed, you should know, I only gave my approval due to circumstances and in a very specific situation. So please, don't schlep me into the discussion. Where and why and in what case did the Maharsham give an allowance? So we're going to visit the United States. Okay, let's visit the United States. Until 1881, what kind of Jews lived in the Americas? Now, Toronto probably had, 50 Jews before 1880? Montreal had more, correct, in those days. Toronto was a little village. But in the United States, the Jews were basically Jews from England, Jews from Germany, and those were the communities that existed here. After 1881 and the pogroms, that's when the face of America changed, where people came from the Pale Settlement, Lithuania, Russia, Ukraine, and had a major shift in the reality of what American Jewry is about. Matzah was produced by shuls. Shuls had a production of matzah, small productions throughout North America. Among them was a production taking place in St. Louis, Missouri. There was a matzah production in St. Louis, Missouri. The rabbi of St. Louis, Missouri was a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Zechariah Yosef Rosenfeld. You have a name there, passed away in 1915. Rabbi Rosenfeld had an impact. He brought up the first Eruv to North America. The first Eruv in North America, St. Louis. And it seems to be the first discussed among poskim, the first discussed in detail production of machine matzah in North America is the one in St. Louis. And there were some questions about the production. It took a half an hour. They tried to shorten it to the 18. So the local rabbi needed a great rabbi in Europe to defend his way of doing things. So Rabbi Rosenfeld from St. Louis sends a question to the Maharsham, and Maharsham responds that you should know, based on the adjustments, and this is what you have here, towards the end of the page, that the Maharsham says, Rabbi Zechariah Yosef Rosenfeld, the Rav of the Agudas Akilas of Be'er, St. Louis. Close enough? St. Louis, America. Im hakol ole yafeh. You should know that if everything, this is at the end of the letter, if everything works out as you clarified, you could allow the matzahs. So Maharsham, right, Rabbi Shwadron allowed the matzah production, the machine matzah production, specifically for what was described in St. Louis. One way to look at it is that he gave approval to machine. Another way to look at it was that due to the fact that in St. Louis it's impossible to have a good hand production, he allowed it there. Okay, but that really was brought, St. Louis was brought into the debate in the land of Israel. By the end of the 1908 to do, there was one of the flyers of the wall. This is a copy of one of the flyers that was placed on the wall in 1908 on the 4th of Nisan. The 4th of Nisan. Now we're on the eve of the 3rd of Nisan. So this is on the 4th of Nisan in Tov Reish Sameches in 1908. And I have here a copy of what Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam, the disciple of Rabbi Yisrael Salant, writes. And he tells us that you should know that I myself went to make my Shmura machine, which is Betachlita Hidur, which is completely done with the higher standards. And therefore, I've never been so happy from baking Shmura matzahs like this year. Meaning, this machine production is better than any hand production of the past. Signed by Rabbi Amsterdam, and he notes, I am, in bold letters, a disciple of Rabbi Yisrael Salant. Meaning, you know who I am. Now, these are Musarites. They don't do it for no reason. He had an agenda, and his agenda was to say, it is fine, and end this debate, end this discussion. So that's reason number one why in the land of Israel there's a positive attitude towards machine shmura. There's the halpering production of machine shmura. And there are many other ones that are on a very high standard. And therefore, and it relates to the idea that those who made their way to Israel believe that something new is occurring. You know, they think that Zionism is the beginning of a new era. In the writings, there's a book called Kol HaTor, based on the writings of the Vilna Gaon, where he talks about a return to the land of Israel which will bring about the coming of the Messiah. And therefore the disciples of the Vilna Gaon, which arrive already in the first decades of the 19th century, they have an understanding that something new is occurring, so they are open for the new far more than Jewry throughout the world, and of course far more than the Hasidim. So that is impact number one. So I can answer half my question. Why is it that I'm answering my children, why is it that I have square machine shmura for the Seder night? Well, I have a connection to the land of Israel from the 1920s, and in the land of Israel, right, and by the way, my grandfather was in a Musar yeshiva. There's no question that traditions from Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam have an impact there. So therefore, machine shmura was considered the ideal in that period of time in the land of Israel. Therefore, I use machine. That's explanation number one. There is one other area where there is an impact. Another area where there's an impact, where machine becomes popular in Israel, works as follows. Remember the third disciple of Rabbi Yisrael Salant, which we did not discuss. What was his name? Rav Dov Ber. Rav Dov Ber had a last name. Rav Dov Ber, who was... No, Rav Dov Ber, who was the favorite disciple of Rabbi Yisrael, who was a shochet, moved to America in 1886. His last name was Rabbi Dov Ber Menashevitz. Okay. In 1888, Menashevitz establishes a matzah bakery, small scale, nothing big. At one point, he gets into a fight with a rabbi there by the name of Rabbi Finkelstein. Rabbi Finkelstein had a well-known son, Louis Finkelstein, Rabbi Louis Finkelstein, but he gets in a fight, and Rabbi Finkelstein decides, you know what? I'm going to open my own matzah operation here. Dov Ber Menashevitz gets nervous. He writes his father in memo, help me, get me some rabbis to prohibit his, help me out here, I'm going to lose my parnasa. And the father responds, you're on your own. In other words, you figure out things on your own to take care of yourself. So, Menashevitz realized that if you want to survive in this industry, you have to be better than your competition. Don't try to kill your competition, right? But try to become better than your competition, and the rest will happen on its own. So he figured out ways, he enhanced his equipment, he cut costs, and he started an advertising campaign. And it worked. Boy, did it work. And therefore, within the next few decades, when you would talk about machine matzahs in North America, you would talk about Manischewitz. Nothing is left from the dozens of small operations like the ones in St. Louis or his competition in Cincinnati. Manischewitz expanded and expanded. Now, part of his marketing was advertising in Jewish publications. Like there was a popular monthly or rabbinic monthly called the Hapardis. And in the Hapardis he would advertise that Rabbi so-and-so eats my matzah. Rabbi so-and-so visited my facility. And he would get letters from the great rabbis of Jerusalem. Okay? And he was linked to Jerusalem because he opened a yeshiva in Jerusalem. And, for example, I have here a copy of a popular Shilas V'Tshuvas from Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, the great rabbi in Jerusalem. And it was collected, who was the one that edited the responsa. So it was a rabbi by the name of Sobel, who was a disciple of the yeshiva of Dov Ber Manischewitz. In other words, there were graduates in Yerushalayim of the Manischewitz yeshiva. Fine? So he was linked to the land of Israel. He would ship his matzahs to the land of Israel. The rabbis in yeshiva would talk about how great and what high standard the matzah of Manischewitz is. There was a strong connection between the two. Fine, makes sense. In 1948, the IRS, the Internal Revenue Services of the United States, looks like Revenue Canada, audits the Manischewitz company. And among the things they find there is that he took a deduction for supporting the yeshiva, a yeshiva called Yeshivas Manischewitz in Yerushalayim. And it was not deductible because it's not a domestic organization. He could not deduct his donations to the yeshiva in Yerushalayim. So, what does he do? He had some good Jewish accountants. You know them? Oh boy, do we know them. And the Jewish accountants argued the following, that you should know that supporting the yeshiva in Yerushalayim was actually a business expense. Supporting a yeshiva as a business expense? Yeah. And he argued that the way you sell matzah to people is by telling them that it is a very high standard. You got to convince them that this is the Torah way of eating matzah. If I link the word Manischewitz and yeshiva means tradition means stringencies, high standards, that's a business expense. And the IRS, they accepted it. And in it, there's a document, you can look it up online, where they present their case that the supporting of the yeshiva in Yerushalayim is basically, I need to be linked to these people. And therefore, when in 1938, the Pardes puts out this pamphlet talking about how great the Manischewitz yeshiva is, and they have letters from all the great rabbis in Yerushalayim. That is because Yerushalayim was supported by Manischewitz, and it was a win-win. A win because people in Eretz Yisrael were able to live off American money and study Torah. And in Cincinnati, Ohio, and by then already in New Jersey as well, the Manischewitz company was able to say, what do you mean? We're the highest standard. You want to find a machine matzah that's reliable, square, highest standard. You eat Manischewitz. It is the matzah of the rabbis, of the great rabbinic authorities. And every once in a while they would publish that Rav Kook ate from it, and so-and-so Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank said it's amazing. And there was a very close relationship between the two. So it comes out that if I would be visiting the land of Israel in the 1920s, when my grandfather was there are two reasons now why the machine was viewed as high standard. There was a yeshiva called Manischewitz, so obviously Manischewitz is something very, very holy. Number two, Reb Naftali Amsterdam argued that the greatest matzah meshmura he ever made was a machine. So therefore, logically, the attitude of the 1920s in the land of Israel was, the machine, the matzah to eat is a machine shmura. Now, let me just end off by telling you the following, and I mentioned this before. The standards today of our machine production is far better than it was 150 years ago. And therefore, if someone would place you, if you would have the standards of 2014, and they would put you in some kind of capsule and shoot you back to 1840, and you would have to eat maybe the early machine or a hand matzah, you would be quite disappointed with their standards. Basically due to the fact that the workers were not so committed, the machines were not so good, and therefore I am of the feeling that anything you eat is kosher, matzah-wise. The standards are far better than the past. If you look at footage on YouTube at the type of smooth equipment that is used for the processing of matzah, you realize that the standards are very, very good. I am of the opinion as well that the shmura, machine shmura, is of course 100% fine. Recently, Chabad advertised on YouTube by comparing hand matzah to the Bentleys. And they have a little clip where they show a production of a Bentley done by hand, and then they shift to hand matzah. The hand matzah is the Bentley of the matzos. Now, if indeed you merit to have a Bentley hand matzah where you were there and you watched the production, perhaps a mass production of hand is no Bentley. In other words, when there is a mass production, you would prefer most probably the machine, because the machine does not get exhausted at the end of the day. A machine is not going to get insulted from the fact that the boss was critical of them and therefore not work with such energy. A machine is more reliable. There are Bentleys, but there are also things made by hand which are not usable. But nevertheless, in this era, everyone should enjoy their matzah, feel they're linked to the past, and may we all merit to have a chag kosher v'sameach, to celebrate. That's what it's about. It's a time of simcha, to celebrate the fact that we are linked to something great. And I do thank the sponsors, and I do thank everyone for coming, and we should have a chag kasher v'sameach.
Are there any questions?